In Walmart's Who'Knewville, everyone ready their cart. Amazing Black Friday deals are about to start. Online and in the app, such great deals to explore. Everything you love from tech, toys, and more. The days to save and the ones to remember. It's only the 25th to the 30th of November. Set your alarms. Don't miss out. These deals are epic, without a doubt. The Who's are all ready, but are you? Walmart Black Friday deals await. Who knew?
Oh, Hilton stay, your beds are soft and cozy. No lumpy couch, no stiff futon, no shower line at crack of dawn. Oh, Hilton stay.
When you want holiday comfort you can count on, it matters where you stay. Enjoy comfortable rooms and friendly service when you stay with Hilton instead. Save up to 25% this season when you book with Hilton. Hilton for the stay. Terms apply.
By 1987 or 88, perhaps, about 40% of Polish people had access to uncensored newspapers and publications. So it meant that the state control on media really had evaporated. The whole system relied on ideological control. And if you can't do that, then you lose control of the population, effectively.
Welcome to the Spymasters Podcast. I'm your host, Antonia Senior. I'm a writer and journalist, and it's my mission to bring you all the best writers on intelligence, fact and fiction, historical and contemporary. Our guest this time is Charlie English, author of the CIA Book Club. Charlie is a journalist and writer, and this new one of his is winning rave reviews, and it's not surprising. It's the incredible story of a plan by the CIA to smuggle banned books behind the Iron Curtain. The Guardian said of it, it's a ripping account of an intriguing and little-known Cold War moment. We've got some fantastic guests coming up on the Spymasters podcast, so don't forget to follow us, review us, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, so we can keep bringing you all the best writers on spies. And now I'll hand you over to me, talking to Charlie English about the CIA Book Club. Charlie, thank you so much for coming on the Spymasters podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So we're here to talk about your book, The CIA Book Club, which I have to say I completely adored. There was so much in there that was new to me and some characters that I didn't know and some familiar things as well. Can you just start by giving us a brief overview for listeners who haven't read the book yet of what the book is about?
Sure. It basically is the story of a US intelligence operation called the CIA Book Program, which began in the mid-1950s. And ran right the way through until the beginning of 91. So it's a kind of 35-year-long program that was designed to undermine the very draconian system of censorship that they had in the Eastern Bloc during the Cold War. The Soviet Union imposed its own censorship methods on every country that was in the kind of Soviet empire, if you like. And to combat this, the CIA sent in roughly 10 million books over this period. And these were a huge range of materials from the kind of overtly political, like George Orwell's 1984 or Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, through to much more perhaps soft literature, lifestyle magazines, fashion magazines, Marie Claire, Cosmo, Life, things like that. So the idea was to kind of show the plurality of the Western system and also to give people access to information that the censorship didn't allow them to have. And I think it was very effective in that.
So it was 10 million items over an extraordinary time period as well. It was 35 years, mainly, as you say, into the kind of satellite states was where it was biggest, I guess, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Romania.
Yeah, I mean, they targeted all of the Eastern Bloc, so they targeted the Soviet Union as well. But some countries took to the program more than others, and Poland was particularly keen on receiving these books. I think partly because Poland had a sort of Western-facing identity already, and they were very upset and felt very betrayed by the Yalta Conference, which put them into the Soviet sphere at the end of the Second World War, and always felt this strong connection. And also there was a very big Polish diaspora in Western Europe and the States and elsewhere. But they were trying to get the books into everywhere. Poland also had a slightly more liberal regime. The Polish secret police were perhaps slightly less vicious than the KGB, who really cracked down on this kind of illegal literature. So Poland was both a kind of slightly easier target and a more enthusiastic recipient of the books. And also, from my point of view, in terms of Cold War history, Poland is, of course, where the Cold War kind of ended, because it was the first domino in the Eastern Bloc to fall. So it's important for that reason as well.
Yeah, so your book focuses very much on Poland and the Polish experience, although, of course, the book club ranged more widely than that. Do you think it's also because the Poles have a very, not to denigrate anybody else, but they do have an incredibly strong literary culture, and a literary culture that's quite central to their national identity as well? You think some of the great Polish writers, whose names I can't pronounce, as we discussed before, it's not press record on this podcast, some of the great Polish writers are kind of central to that sense of Polish identity that they had to struggle for throughout Russian imperialism as well as Soviet imperialism, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's right. The Poles have been fighting off their neighbours one way or another for hundreds of years, and the Tsars before the communists, so I think literature was a big part of that. And also this kind of sense of illegal literature dates back, I think, into the 19th century, certainly, as a way of resisting. It's interesting, the Polish word conspiracy doesn't have any negative connotation in Poland, because conspiracy is seen as a good thing, because they've been fighting off these kind of oppressive neighbours for so long. And so there is a sort of culture of resistance that existed in Poland for many decades or even centuries. Yeah.
So, of course, the structure of your book reflects the book club itself, the CIA operation itself, because obviously there's the CIA element, the people working for the organisation within America, and then there's the people in Poland and elsewhere. But obviously we'll focus on Poland because that's where you focus in the book. Poland and elsewhere, who disseminate this literature. So can we talk a bit about both sides of the equation? So the CIA guys, talk to me about the origins of the CIA plan to do this. Who was behind it?
Well, the CIA plan really came out of the Free Europe Committee, which was a psychological warfare outfit that set up in the aftermath of the Second World War, really to make use of the large numbers of East European emigres who washed up in the West after the war. And these were people who were often very motivated to try and liberate their home countries, but didn't have any resources to do so. So the Free Europe Committee was designed, in a sense, to give the resources to these people and to help them out. And of course, the most famous sort of success stories in the early days anyway were the radios, Radio Liberty and Radio Free Europe, which broadcast in the languages of East European countries and gave them uncensored news reports and, I guess you'd say, American propaganda. So the radios were susceptible to jamming, and they wanted to kind of broaden the offering, if you like. So they experimented first with balloon drops of propaganda leaflets, which went on for, I think, 5 or 6 years and dropped tens of millions, perhaps hundreds of millions of leaflets. But these were not very well received because they didn't have any value, and they were, if you were caught with one of these leaflets, then it was a black mark against you, so people didn't really want to hold on to them. But when they started experimenting with books, and particularly sending books through the mail, which was how they first did it, people wanted to hold on to the books, and sometimes they would even write and ask for more books. So the people who were running the book program at that point realized there was this kind of a big opportunity there. And in particular, there was a Romanian American called George Minden, who, like many of these characters, had been forced to flee his own country, had ended up in New York working for the Free Europe Committee. And he became the leader of the book program and would run it until 1991. And Minden, under Minden's supervision, he was, I think, probably quite an intellectual man, a very intelligent man, a very secretive man. And he ran an operation out of Manhattan, Park Avenue South. There's a big tower block which is still there, and they had a kind of anonymous office on the 14th floor of this block. And the cover organisation was called the International Literary Centre, and they pretended to be a sort of philanthropic organisation that was interested in East European literature, but in fact they were funded by the CIA, and Minden wrote reports for the CIA, and CIA came and visited. I guess they were kind of contractors to the CIA, if you like, and they oversaw this great network of book distribution, which took a wide variety of forms. There was the mail program, there was what they called person-to-person distribution, which meant that if you're an East European traveller and you came to, say, London or Paris or Vienna, you could go to a certain address, often a bookshop, and turn up and say, I've come here from Warsaw, and they would give you free books on the understanding that you would take them home with you. So and then the CIA would pay for these books. So it was a sort of mass movement in that sense of books, in that tens of thousands of people would visit from the East and visit these shops, these stores, and take books back with them in their luggage. And if one of these shipments was caught, then of course it didn't really matter very much because there were only 3 or 4 books within it.
Oh.
And then I suppose as the time went on, the shipments got more and more sophisticated. They started. I mean, I've got here this is a kind of miniature of a Polish emigre publication called Kultura, which was produced in Paris, and it's, as you can see, it's tiny, and it fitted inside a tin of, say, baked beans. So, and they had canning equipment. And they'd slip these into the cans and then take them on humanitarian relief trucks into Eastern Europe. They put books on yachts. There's a story of a copy of Gulag Archipelago going to Moscow in a baby's nappy. I call it a kind of planes, trains, automobiles technique, where any route was experimented with, and if it worked, then they would carry on with that.
But and certainly initially, it wasn't clear to the people receiving the books that it was the CIA funding it, right? You have an anecdote in the story that, for example, Pope John Paul II, when he was a cardinal, was receiving some of these books and wrote a thank you letter. But your contention is that he didn't know it was a CIA operation. He just was thanking someone for the nice books.
Yes, I mean, nobody would have known that they were getting them from the CIA. And in fact, the CIA and Minden would use mainstream publishers to send the books often. So Doubleday, let's say in New York, would have a meeting with the ILC, and they'd agree a list of books and addresses to send the books to. Doubleday, I'm using Doubleday as an example. I mean, there were lots of different publishers. They would send the books out to these addresses in Eastern Europe. So as far as the person in Eastern Europe was concerned, the publisher in Manhattan was sending them the book. They wouldn't have known who was paying for that book or who was organising the shipment of it. So, yeah, I don't think Karol Wojtyla would have known that it was the CIA sending the books. But the CIA were when he was made Pope, the CIA were very proud and pointed out in a memo to the White House that he had been a recipient of their books. He also listened to Radio Free Europe, I think. I think there are stories of him listening to Jan Nowak on the Polish service as he shaved every morning. So he was, he was a sort of fellow traveller with the dissident cause.
In that instance, the CIA, were quick to take some credit, but you make it clear in the book that the CIA is not a monolithic organisation, and that the book club wasn't necessarily supported across the board.
Yeah, I think certainly within the CIA, these operations were seen as slightly kind of effete and intellectual, and a veteran told me that the agency tended to split into 2 factions. There was a sort of political, psychological staff who were often very well-educated, experts in their country, spoke the language, etc. And then there was the more paramilitary side, who were often ex-army types, and their idea of themselves was that they would go into the world's trouble spots and blow things up and, ship guns to people. And it tended to be the paramilitaries who got the upper hand within the agency. So they didn't really, according to this veteran anyway, really appreciate some of the more intellectual activities of this side of the operation. And yeah, I mean, I think they probably undervalued them. They thought they couldn't see any kind of tangible results for a very long time. And it was fairly poor compared with other CIA operations. So, for instance, The book program at the end was running a budget of about $3 million a year, I think, where operation in Afghanistan was costing, I think, $700 million a year. I think 80% of the agency's overseas budget was spent arming the Mujahideen. And so when it came to the end of the Cold War and people wanted to give credit to certain CIA activities, it was obviously more politically expedient to give credit to the Afghan operation than it was, for instance, the book program, which was very much a poor cousin. But I think actually it was probably equally effective, but these things are hard to judge, of course.
I'd like to come back to that issue of quantifying the effectiveness of it. But can we just talk for a minute about the flip side of the coin, the people receiving these books? So you kind of follow a couple of characters through the book who are involved in underground publishing and also just the wider dissemination of this material. Can you just talk us through what it looked like from the Polish side?
Yeah, I mean, so as I said earlier, the Poles had a sort of tradition of underground literature going back to pre-war days at least. And the books arrived, I guess they started arriving in Poland in the from the West. And we should remember that the CIA weren't the only people sending uncensored literature in. I mean, they had a very big role, I think, in promoting it, but it was sort of a pre-existing culture that happened among the Polish expats and the Poles in Poland anyway. And yeah, so the books, when they reached Poland, would be treated as very kind of precious items. I mean, they were circulated among groups of dissidents, often disguised in pages of the party newspaper, for instance. And often people would be given them for one night and then they would have to pass them on to someone else because they were trying to circulate them as widely as possible, these kind of forbidden ideas. And in fact, there were whole libraries of illicit material that began to grow up in Poland. There's one case that I explored in some depth, which was the case of the Warsaw Flying Library, as it was called. It was flying because it never touched the ground. I mean, it was never supposed to be in one place. It had no physical premises, but the books would be circulating all the time. But it was very well organized. It was divided into sections of politics and history and so on. And the woman who led this library had, I think, something like 500 or 600 books by around 1979, 1980, and had an organized system of couriers who would come with backpacks and take a little package of books, and they would circulate them among their clientele. And nobody knew who anybody else was. So if the secret police arrested somebody, then they wouldn't be able to wind up the whole operation because they had sort of firewalls, if you like, between the various readers and the flats where the books were occasionally stored and the main organizer of the whole thing. So this kind of, all the Solidarity generation of dissidents that I spoke to, who were really the people who brought down communism in the end, all of them seem to have grown up on these books, which I thought was fascinating. I mean, it was a very long play, if you like, but there were people who were born in the late 40s who would have been at school reading copies of Orwell and Kultura, which is this banned publication that was produced in Paris, and finding out about the world in a way that they were really not allowed to, because the censor would, for instance, not allow them to know that Stalin had deported all these Poles to Siberia, or that the NKVD had murdered tens of thousands of Polish officers in the forests at Katyn. So there was lots of aspects of their own culture and history they were not allowed to know officially, and these books would tell them about that, and they would sort of promote this dissident movement effectively.
Just when I read it on the Kindle and I highlighted so many bits of it that I found very inspiring. But so one of your dissidents that you spoke to, a guy called Azim Michnik, he said to you, "We should build a monument to books. I'm convinced it was books that were victorious in the fight. A book is like a reservoir of freedom, of independent thought, a reservoir of human dignity. A book was like fresh air. They allowed us to survive and not go mad." I mean, wow.
It's a beautiful quote. Adam Michnik produces phrases like that, every other sentence. He's a a great master of language, but he was one of the most intellectual of the Solidarity era dissidents. He's still editor-in-chief of Gazeta Wyborcza, which is the main newspaper, if you like, in Poland. And he was a great writer and a great reader. And I should make clear that he wasn't talking there about CIA sent books necessarily. He was talking about literature that arrived. And of course, we can't really know the origin of it all. But he spent a lot of the 80s in jail, actually, and he would get his partner to smuggle books in to prison, and he would read them in jail. And in fact, he would write pieces in jail and they would be smuggled out. I mean, he wouldn't tell me how he did this, even, 20, 30 years later. But he was expert at writing pieces and getting them published in the underground press or even in the Western media. I mean, I think Mitnick was writing for probably the New York Times in the 80s. So, yeah, I mean, he spoke very eloquently about the power of literature, and he wasn't the only one. I mean, they're they're a very kind of intellectual group, and they're a great group of readers. People like Joanna Szczesna, who was a journalist on the underground newspaper Mazovia Weekly, is another one, and she would spent much of the 80s in hiding or in jail. In her hiding places in the flats she would go to escape the secret police, she would be reading whole copies of Kultura and illegal, illicit books. Yeah, so they're a great bunch of people.
Can you just tell us a bit explicitly about what the potential penalties were for both sort of passing on this information and, creating it? Like, how dangerous was it?
Well, I think of it slightly as we would think about drugs. So if you were caught in possession, then you would have a kind of black mark against you, but it wouldn't necessarily be a judicial, a jail sentence of any kind. I mean, you've got to remember that in a police state, everything you do can be held against you one way or another. So if the secret police raided and they found a bookshelf full of illegal books, that would go on your record, and then it could be used to blackmail you later on, because the police were always trying to turn people to give evidence against somebody else, some political enemy of the state. But if you were caught printing books, for instance, which happened a lot in the 80s, then you were in deep trouble and you could be sent to jail for quite a long time. I mean, the punishments and the amount of censorship changed quite a lot over the period. So there were periods of liberalization, and then there were crackdowns, and then liberalization again, as the state kept trying to kind of reset its relationship with the people. So, for instance, from August 1980 to December 81 was this period known as the Solidarity Carnival, when really you could get away with anything. You could I mean, the book smugglers were having a field day in that period, because there weren't really many checks at the border at all, and the censors weren't as vicious as they were before. But then in December 81, you have Jaruzelski announces this martial law and the crackdown. There are tanks on the streets, and all of the Solidarity dissidents are arrested and thrown into internment, and all the illegal print shops are smashed up. So things change over time, but certainly you could be jailed for a long time if you were caught, as my lead character, Mirek Hoyecki, is caught at the start of the book, and he's thrown in jail. And he didn't know how long he was going to be in jail. It turned out to be not that long, but they could keep people for years. And part of the punishment, if you like, was not knowing how long you were going to be in jail, and it could go on forever.
It's quite difficult reading, actually, the bit where Hoyecki's in jail and he's on hunger strike for a while, and then they force feed him. You don't shy away from describing that process.
Well, I wanted to get across the sort of severity of it, really, and I went into that jail, Mokotów jail in Warsaw, and it's a pretty horrific place. It's sort of opened as a tourism. I mean, it's sort of a museum now, but it's quite hard to get into, even so. And I went round with a tour guide who told me of all the kind of horrors that had been committed there over the years by the NKVD and the secret police of one kind or another, torturing and executing people. I mean, it wasn't really like that by the late 70s. Things were a bit milder, but it was still a pretty horrible place to be sent.
With new, gentler scented Clorox disinfecting wipes, clean finally smells as good as it feels on everything from lamps to ceiling fans, even on your kid's toy shark. Oh, ouch. Clorox disinfecting wipes, now available in crisp lemon. Find it on Amazon. Clorox, clean feels good.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to tell you that Michelob Ultra, the official beer partner of the NBA, is bringing NBA fans closer than ever this season with chances to win great prizes, including courtside tickets. Enter now at michelobultra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra Courtside 25 to 26. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 plus. Begins on October 1st, 2025 and ends on June 30th, 2026. Multiple entry periods. See official rules at michelobultra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, prizes, and details.
You make it very clear that for the authorities, it was the volume of uncensored, unfiltered, uncontrolled material that was such a challenge. They didn't know how to respond. And that was, I guess, partly fed into the kind of wider sense that they didn't know how to respond at all to the kind of growth of the solidarity movement. It was a sort of institutional paralysis of a police state. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, they couldn't stop it. I mean, as time went on and more underground presses grew up in Poland in the 80s, often, by the way, funded by the CIA or supplied by the CIA in one way or another. By the mid-80s, there was just so much material washing about that they'd really lost control of the narrative, if you like, and their grip on the ideas and the ideology was completely lost. I mean, they had no way of stopping people knowing things that they wanted to know. And I think there's some statistic that by 1987 or 88, perhaps, about 40% of Polish people had access to uncensored newspapers and publications. So it meant that the state control on media really had evaporated. The whole system relied on ideological control, and if you can't do that, then you lose control of the population effectively.
Can we talk a little bit about the type of material? I was really interested in that. So obviously, as you said right at the beginning, some of it, particularly later on, is the sort of, the fashion magazines and I guess the aspirational stuff. I got the sense reading the book that early doors, it was quite kind of propagandist and sort of Western authors. And then increasingly it became the literature written by the people themselves of the countries that they were targeting, because that was probably more effective. But quite a lot of it, there was some good stuff right at the beginning with George Orwell. I mean, I really like that. You quote the British academic Timothy Garton Ash, who said that everywhere, what he said, I've got the quote here, he said, all over communist ruled Europe, people would show me their dog-eared copies of Animal Farm or 1984 and ask, how did he know? I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, Orwell is almost a saint in Poland. I mean, the funny thing about Orwell is he never went to Eastern Europe, but he seemed to understand intuitively what they were all going through. And his concepts like doublethink, for instance, I think were really taken up in Eastern Europe. I mean, one character who ran the Warsaw Flying Library related to me how when she went to school, for instance, they would only be able to speak in a certain way, in a kind of Marxist-Leninist way, which assumed that Western imperialism was trying to retake Eastern Europe and that German neo-Nazis were trying to invade Poland again. And the Americans wanted to drop the Colorado beetle on their potato crops to destroy them and starve the people. And this was all propaganda, obviously. And when she got home and talked to her parents, they talked in a much more normal way about you didn't have to assume that certain things that weren't true were true. So everybody had to live in that kind of doublethink state. And in fact, Hoyetsky, at one point when he was on trial, made the point in court how damaging this was to society, because you couldn't, nothing was real. Miłosz, the Polish novelist, had the idea that Poland was a logocracy, meaning that it was a government or a country of words, where the words didn't bear any relation to what was actually happening in the real world, which I think is quite a kind of powerful idea. And they had kind of state-sanctioned types of art. I mean, Stalin only wanted social realist art, so even Orwell's technique of allegory in Animal Farm was outlawed because it was somehow seen as duplicitous. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, I think it's quite hard for us to understand, living in the West and growing up in the West, the sort of damaging effect this has on a kind of psyche, as a national psyche. And Orwell expressed that, I think, very well for them. But yeah, authors, I think you're probably right that they started out with more Western material. I mean, it wasn't necessarily absolutely political. There was, for instance, a book about painting that was very popular in the early years of the book program. I think it was called 300 Years of American Painting. But you know, everything that we think of as just the norm over there had a political meaning, even when it wasn't overtly political. I mean, one dissident told me, you know, if you got a copy of Life magazine and you saw a beachfront property in California with a swimming pool, this was an extraordinarily powerful thing to see in the Eastern Bloc, where you probably didn't have your own property, you certainly didn't have a swimming pool, certainly wasn't on the beach. And similarly, someone told me about Agatha Christie, even a kind of crime thriller, which talked about people having a house and a car and eating nice food, for instance, had a very different meaning there, where you probably had to go and queue for your food or for, you had to queue for the shops, which were often kind of short of material. So yeah, I mean, Minden himself said that everything has a different political meaning in the East. Fashion too, you know, if you weren't really supposed to be interested in fashion in the Eastern Bloc, it was seen as a kind of frivolous thing, and there wasn't that much to buy in the shops. So fashion magazines were also a kind of powerful vector of kind of Westernness and the benefits of freedom.
I loved the idea that, you know, the kind of direct propaganda kind of leaflets and stuff doesn't really cut through, but just kind of consistently and persistently presenting a kind of truthful narrative eventually does. I found that quite powerful, especially maybe given where we are today, where there's a sort of thuggishness in politics and there's a sort of persistent sense that if you lie loudly enough, eventually it will be believed. And I felt that in your book, there was very much a sense that the truth matters, and eventually it will matter more if you just stick to it.
Yeah, Minden has this quote. I think he says something like, "Truth is contagious," and if they could just get enough truth into the Eastern Bloc, then it was bound to have a powerful effect. And I've thought about that quite a lot, obviously, in the situation we're all in now, and how, I mean, it's such a kind of simple message, and I think it's much more difficult now to know what the truth is. We live in an age really of immense amounts of disinformation. And I think the difference between then and now is that the censors in the Eastern Bloc were trying to restrict the amount of information people could have, mainly to quite a narrow diet of Marxist ideology. And so the CIA's aim was to break that stranglehold. And now we're in a situation where the digital sphere means that there are millions of channels for information to come through, and millions of different types of information, a lot of which is just not true. And it's incredibly easy to, I mean, you know, Trump is, I think they call it flooding the zone, don't they? But basically they're just pumping stuff out. Much of it is lies. And it's very hard for even educated readers of the news to work out exactly what's true and what isn't.
It absolutely, and social media changes everything. I think this is one of the reasons why one should just stick to books completely, ignore podcasts and all other nonsense you hear on the internet. There was another kind of element to all of that I thought was really interesting. So you have another character that we haven't really talked about, whose name is Gidroich, who lives in Paris or outside Paris in France.
Western Paris, yeah, suburbs.
Yeah, in this sort of kind of elaborate home, which becomes a kind of place that's welcoming to all exiles, and he's being funded by the CIA, but he's also a kind of very interesting character. Can you just tell us a bit about him, and then I'll sort of
Sure. His name's Jerzy Gidroich. He's a sort of aristocratic Pole who was forced, like many, to flee at the end of the Second World War. He ended up with the Polish Free Army, the Anders Army, as it's called, and working in a propaganda unit there with another very important Polish emigre called Józef Czapski, who was an artist and writer who had been in the camps in Siberia. And in the war, they had a propaganda unit working for the Polish military. And at the end of the war, found themselves in Paris. And Gidroich and his group of close friends had the idea of setting up a publishing house that would work for a free and independent Poland that would be liberated from Stalin. And the main product of this operation was a publication called Kultura, which is, I've spoken about it already. It's a sort of literary political periodical, again, quite intellectual. And the editions look, they're kind of perfect bound, almost like a book. And so in the very early 1950s, Gidroich was struggling to make enough money to keep Kultura and his publishing house on the road, as it were. And he and Czapski went to the States to try and raise money, and they met with some people from the CIA and agreed a kind of funding arrangement where the CIA would pay, I think it was $10,000 a year, but it was a good sum. I mean, it was certainly enough to keep Gidroich afloat. And Gidroich maintained that relationship for the rest of the Cold War. The sums increased as time went on. He was a very important CIA asset in Paris, and a tremendously important figure for Poles around the world, both in Poland and outside it, because of his intellect, really, and his politics. He was a fierce defender of independent Poland, and his work, his magazines were smuggled into Poland for decades. There was a famous case where a group of young, I think they were students, were caught smuggling his works across the Tatra Mountains into Poland, and they were arrested in a kind of sting operation and put on trial and given jail sentences of, I think, several years. But really, the person the Polish state wanted to put on trial was Gidroich, and he was obviously in Paris. He was really the public enemy number one, I think, of the Polish regime, but a very significant figure. And he worked throughout this time with the book program, and he was a very important part of the Polish book program.
He's an incredible character in the book. He really comes across. I was already a big admirer of Józef Czapski. His memoir In Human Land, I think, is one of the best things I've ever read on what we were talking about before, about how you hold on to the truth when the environment you're living in is comprised of lies. But Gidroich, I can't say his name. Gidroich. Yeah, one of the things he said really stuck with me as well. It's another one of my many highlighted passages from your book, where he said, I had always maintained that if I had to apply absolute political or moral tests to writers, Polish literature would cease to exist. I therefore considered that we ought to distinguish the author from his work, to let the work stand apart. For me, it is a general attitude of mind. I thought that was a fascinating thing, because I'm not sure that that's necessarily a sentiment that is very fashionable in kind of modern publishing circles.
Yeah, I like that very much. I mean, he wasn't talking about the CIA specifically in that quote, but it seemed to me to suit his position quite well. And if you talk to a lot of these dissidents, there is this sort of tacit, unspoken, often idea that they were supported by what is obviously quite in some ways a nasty intelligence organization, but that they had very little choice. And, they were caught up in a war between two superpowers. They were trying to liberate their small country caught in the middle. And, faced with either kind of Brezhnev or Reagan, they chose the side of Reagan. And I think you're right. I mean, in our kind of, I suppose, fairly comfortable liberal lives, we disapprove of certain aspects of what perhaps Reagan or the CIA did. But for these people, there wasn't really any choice. It was one side or the other. And I think that Giedroyc quote tries to capture the idea that you can be independent and ethical within your own kind of moral framework, while also, in his case, taking money from the CIA. So I think it's a kind of interesting moral dilemma that they must have thought about, probably only for about 10 seconds. But
yeah, before they took the money.
Exactly.
And just as a, summation, what do you think the impact was? How significant was both the book club itself and the wider culture of uncensored material proliferating to the collapse of the Soviet Empire?
Well, I think it was highly significant. I'm not going to claim that it in itself ended the Cold War. There were far too many factors involved in that. I mean, the economic one is probably the principal one. The kind of leaching of resources into Afghanistan in terms of intelligence operations is obviously significant too. But I would say that I think if you talk to Poles and Polish dissidents, this is the thing. This is the thing they pick out. This is the important thing. And it's summarized in that Adam Mitnick quote that you read out earlier. I mean, after martial law, the only sign that solidarity was still alive in the underground were these independent publications that they put out. The kind of whole movement is intrinsically tied up with the idea of uncensored publications, and not only because that's where they learnt a lot of the ideas that powered the movement and sort of shaped their strategy, but also as a kind of ongoing way of communicating with the people who thought they'd been crushed, that they were still going and still alive and so on. And I mean, I think everybody that I interviewed from the Solidarity era acknowledged that uncensored publications were absolutely vital. That they saw them as their principal weapon, if you like, against the state. I mean, they quite early on, people like Mitnick took the decision that they weren't going to try and run an armed conflict, an armed rebellion against the regime, because they just knew they would have lost, and they never really quite knew what Moscow's response would have been. But obviously in Prague and in Hungary earlier in the century, they had just sent in the tanks. So they knew it was going to have to be a sort of soft intellectual, soft power revolution. And really that's what they pulled off. And I think, as Mitnick said, it was books that were victorious in the fight. It was books that won it.
There's another lovely quote. I'm going to quote back to you. The father of your underground publisher that you follow, Hoyetsky, his father says to him, "Do you think, Mirek, that you'll be able to bring down the communist system with your little books?" He would ask. "Do you think your little words will make a difference?" God, I'm reading it very badly, sorry. And then Hoyetsky would answer with a question of his own: "Would you prefer me to shoot someone?"
Yeah, I love that little exchange from Hoyetsky. Yeah, I mean, he's a great character, and of course his parents were both war heroes. And his mother was in the Warsaw Uprising, and I think his father was too. And his mother was in they're so immensely brave. She was in a unit of the Polish partisan Home Army who would go around assassinating people who were Nazi officers, basically, who were sentenced by the underground Polish court. And their most famous attack was of this guy called Kuchera, who was the chief of police in the Nazi chief of police in Warsaw and had murdered hundreds of Poles. And they managed to assassinate him, I think, in broad daylight in a Warsaw street. So, there's a sort of generation of heroes that, if you like, was the parents of this other generation of heroes, but they had to adopt very different methods. I mean, it was a great tragedy what happened to Poland in the war. And I think they perhaps, I don't want to speak for them, but perhaps learned that the Warsaw Uprising as a kind of armed rebellion had terrible consequences. And so that wasn't really the route they were going to take when it came to the East and trying to throw off the Soviets.
I was constantly thinking when I was reading your book about Hanna Kahansky's book on resistance, in which she says, she argues effectively that it's not always the act of resistance itself, but the idea of resistance that's most key. And the idea of resistance is part of the war uprising, and it's part of an underground publishing operation. I mean, both of them, it's still creating an idea of an independent Poland that survives the totalitarian regimes that are out to get them, perhaps. Just as a final question, Charlie, because I could talk about this for hours, but I think we should probably come to an end. If you were to recommend to our listeners a couple of the books that the CIA Book Club were enthusiastically smuggling across the borders into Poland, which ones would you most want to press into the hands of my listeners?
Well, it's a difficult question. There's so much great stuff there. I mean, I had not read Miłosz before I embarked on this project, and I did, and I thought there's something really magnificent about him. And it's probably not very fashionable these days, but it's quite grand, big, sweeping prose. It's philosophy, history, it's biography, all kind of wrapped into one, and perhaps in a kind of East European way. And I really love that.
You wrote The Captive Mind. Is that Miłosz? Was that
Captive Mind and Native Realm? Yeah, probably his two. But I mean, he also wrote a lot of poetry, which I haven't read all of, obviously.
You should. I've read his poetry, actually. I think it's amazing. I think his poetry is gorgeous. I mean, I loved Captive Mind as well, but I haven't read Native Realm, so that's definitely on my list now. Anybody else that we would?
Well, I'd probably always come back to Orwell, who I obviously have read multiple times, but I think it's always worth returning to. 1984, particularly in this kind of moment, feels very relevant. Who else? Kurt Vonnegut. I've got Mother Night here, which was a book I hadn't. I was a kind of complete ingenue as far as Vonnegut went, and I read a couple of his books during this process, and he's a fabulous writer. I mean, I'm sure you've read him. You're much better read than me, I'm sure, but I would recommend him to people who haven't.
Wonderful. Well, I would highly recommend the CIA Book Club to everybody listening to this, and I'm sure they'll rush out and buy after this. And I'd just like to say thank you so much for coming on Spymasters, Charlie.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to follow, tweet, spread the word, so that we can keep bringing you more brilliant writers talking about spies. Don't miss an episode of the Spymasters Podcast.
The holidays mean more travel, more shopping, more time online, and more personal info in more places that could expose you more to identity theft. But LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, our US-based restoration specialists will fix it, guaranteed, or your money back. Don't face drained accounts, fraudulent loans, or financial losses alone. Get more holiday fun and less holiday worry with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.